Kia ora koutou katoa. Good evening, everybody. David Faulkner, General Manager of Property Brokers Property Management. Great to be with you this evening. I am joined again by our Professor Graham Squires. Graham, who's from the Property Knowledge and also down in Lincoln University. And for those people tuning in for the first time, may never have seen Graham talk before. Graham, just a little bit of background about yourself, please, and before we get into tonight's discussion.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a Professor of Property Studies at Lincoln University. I'm also the Director of Property Knowledge, as David just mentioned. My day job is an academic, but I'm a very applied academic, hence me being here. And I spend a lot of time researching in the areas of property development, planning and housing. Housing is always my sort of first home in terms of, if you pardon the pun, in terms of where I like to do my research. And I'm also editor of a journal. So the journal's called the Property Management Journal. It's largely for an academic audience, but it means that I've got a good connection and a good reach to what's happening around the world and looking at the big picture stuff. But I also like to look at what's happening sort of in a more applied nature, as I say, in terms of what's happening in the market. And, you know, given my being in New Zealand, I've nearly chalked up 8 years. Very, very close to what's happening in New Zealand. So I've always followed the woes and the highs of what's happens in the housing market, whether that's owner-occupied market, in the sales market, or whether it's in the rental market. And yeah, this is sort of, as we see on the screen, it's our 10th issue. So we're covering a lot. It's quite nice. We've been covering a lot of, for those that haven't followed this, we've been covering a lot of different issues, and it's been nice not just to follow what's happening in the stats. We like to sort of, yes, look at what's happening in the bigger picture, but what that means to people's decision making, you know, in terms of your clients, I suppose, David.
So, I mean, one of the things that we covered on the last one was what's happening with population, and you've alluded to this in our latest reports, and like net migration was around about 130,000 approximately last year, which was a record. A lot of people coming from countries like the Philippines and India, and it led us to the question on this report. And I put the question to you, Graham. Do we actually have a housing crisis in New Zealand? Because from the research that we see here, in terms of the number of dwellings as a ratio to population, there isn't much of a change. Do we have a housing crisis?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question, isn't it? Do we have a housing crisis? It depends what we mean by a crisis and all those sorts of things. But I won't give you the full academic answer. I suppose what we can glean from what's happening here is that, well, okay, we've been in a position in New Zealand where house prices have sort of stagnated, you know, for all the reasons that we know post-COVID. And also we've seen, so that sort of, we've also seen demand start to increase if we take population as a driver, but house prices staying the same. So that sort of raises questions about, well, you can make a cheeky remark that, well, maybe we're undersupplied if prices are going down and demand's going up. But there's more to it. We know there's more to it than that. So we're sort of keeping an eye in terms of what's happening in a micro sense, and that's what this report's about, is looking at supply of houses in terms of dwellings and the number of properties available, you know, and relative to demand through population. So there's that micro element, supply demand, that we always talk about, and there's always a sort of a supply narrative to this. But it's also being mindful of the bigger picture and the macro picture, isn't it? You know, we're never far away from talking about what's happening with interest rates. Inflation's obviously been talk of the town in the last sort of year. Growth, employment, you know, and we can probably talk about that as we get through the numbers. But also, you know, on the backdrop of this, we're talking about decades worth of policy change. You know, arguably, you know, a shift more to a freer market in terms of houses that are available. If you look at the tenure percentages, you know, social housing sort of, you know, remained at that 3-4% all the way, and it's quite negligible really. But I think the interesting part of New Zealand and the sort of move to a freer market is the rise in sort of rental properties, you know, and I think we talked about we use the fancy term rentierisation of the market, and New Zealand's very much that, isn't it? You know, when we look at the numbers of people who actually own homes and rent them out, you know, second homes or investment properties as we call them, I guess, that's quite, you know, quite a stark amount of the stock. So there's those issues of rentierisation, this financialisation. You know, in the last 50 years, we've not seen so much debt and lending backed against housing, and people using that as an asset vehicle, you know, as an investment vehicle, essentially, isn't it? So that's a sort of an interesting part. And whether it's a crisis, is it a crisis of ownership? Is it a crisis of investment? You know, and is it a crisis of affordability? There's all those sorts of things that every New Zealander knows about because we've got a vested interest in it. So it can come back to it's in the eye of the beholder sometimes. You know, if property is doing well and you own a few properties, you would argue there's no crisis at all, I would imagine, but it depends on what your moral outlook is. But if you're struggling to buy a house and and if that's your aspiration, then you would see it as a crisis. So sometimes it's a whose crisis as well. So massive question, but I guess what this report does is sort of look from in a micro sense, you know, looking at that sort of population change and looking at dwellings. So I was interested to sort of, if we just stick it onto the first graph, probably a nice way to pictorially show what's going on. Does that sound good?
Well, I mean, we've got 30 years or just over 30 years, and I suspect that this has evolved from the evolution of the internet, and we start to collect information. And you know, when look at tenancy services data, it goes back to 1993. You've got going back to 1991. Interesting to see how the population has changed and the number of dwellings. I'll leave with you, Graham. What's happened?
Yeah, so these so we've got 7 figures here, and I like that we can sort of paint a picture here. So the first part here is number of dwellings. So I'm not sure when you arrived on these shores, David, but 91 we're sort of seeing 1.3, something like that, 1.2, 1.3, and then we've just broken the 2 million mark in terms of number of dwellings. You know, these are the actual number of buildings that are habitable for people to reside in.
Just confirm that's 2 million residential dwellings, homes.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So that could cover any tenure, whether that's owner occupied, private rent, or social provision. So you can see that, and we talk about sort of the supply crisis. You can see that's a sort of quite a uniform increase when you look at you can see that it's sort of quite uniform. Maybe in the last 10 years we're sort of seeing changes, a little bit of a steeper rise in terms of the supply. But I think obviously what we're looking at here is supply versus demand. So in sort of very stark terms. I suppose before we get into that, layering on top of the demand part of it, there's the tenure breakdown. So it's sort of, I think one thing that we found interesting here is that we look over this 30-year period. We're seeing owner occupier dwellings as a proportion increasing over time. So you can see the blue band starting to increase as a proportion relative to rental, and those that are they use the term provided free with Stats New Zealand. We've sort of seen that sort of pretty much be uniform that I mentioned at the start of the conversation, I suppose. So we're seeing that sort of change, and I suppose when you look at the percentage share, I think that's the real interesting thing when people talk about owner occupations starting to fall away. I think what we see actually in the last 10 years, so when you look from sort of 2014 onwards, there's no real change at all. Is the 3% provided free stays the same, the owner occupation at 65% stays the same, the rented amount at 32% stays the same. So those sort of trends of change are sort of pretty uniform.
Yeah. So looking at this chart, I mean, if we look at over on the far left hand side, the red is what percentage of rental dwellings. You can see that has increased, and then you're right, it flatlines. Yeah. So we haven't really seen, it's been the same for 10 years really in relation to population. Is that how I'm translating that?
So yeah, this is just sort of supply. So I mean, population stuff is a bit further on here. I mean, this figure is just sort of just overlaying, I suppose, part of the conversation that people were not familiar with the numbers. Generally, in terms of supply and rental supply, we can look at bonds from MB. So those that are taken, if you're going to rent out a property and you register it, it's a bond. And these numbers, as we can see here, 2024, you're sort of up to that sort of 400,000 mark. but be mindful that in numbers of dwellings, that's significantly more because not every person registers with MB in terms of their bond. So
can I ask a question? You may not be able to answer this. I mean, if we can see 400,000+ bonds lodged with tenancy services, the government of the day, or statistics show that there's over 600,000 rental properties. How do they know if some of these properties don't have bonds against them?
So it's just so they just wait. If they're not registered, they're not registered. So that 200,000 difference, I'm guessing that's people who just do that on their own and don't register. I guess it's lodgers and things like that.
How do we know that they are actually rental properties?
It's just, I suppose the straight answer is we don't know, do we?
No.
So it's a sort of something that's sort of captured by the census, essentially. So it's the difference between the census and the bonds data.
If that's how they get that figure, the 600,000.
So it's a census, and then it's adjusted year on year as they add the change. So that's so it's still rough and ready, but I think that it is. I think the important bit here also is not just what's not picked up. It's sort of the 200,000 is a lot of properties. So I suppose when we do the analysis on the bonds data, you got to be mindful that that's not everything and the be all and end all. There's a lot more in that, So I think that's sort of a critical
point of interest, right? Before you carry on, tenancy services. I know very much how they do the bond system, and it's quite antiquated. So you'll have to fill out your bond form or whatever it may be. You send it to tenancy services for the payment, and I know that they don't actually capture every single property, because if a bond form isn't filled out correctly, they won't enter it into the statistics. And so tenancy services are finally getting into, say, the 21st century, and they're starting to launch a new bond system which should be able to capture more bonds being lodged accurately. So we may even see the number of bonds go up more steeply as they bring in this new system, because it will actually capture real-time data rather than somebody having to read a bond form and then somebody having to manually type it into a system, which is what happens at the moment. So be interested to see how that impacts nation being entered into. But anyway, you can carry on.
So I guess that'll close the gap slightly, but I imagine most of the gap is just people just not registering because they feel they don't need to. If they're just sort of a direct payment to the tenant in theory, but they're not sort of an official tenant, if that makes sense.
So they are breaking the Residential Tenancies Act.
Yeah, so there's something to look at in terms of how that's policed then, because that's a significant number, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah. All right, we better swiftly move on before our lawyers get involved. No, I quit. Right. So I guess that sort of presents a nice picture of what's happening in terms of dwellings. There was that 2 million. We're looking at those percentage differences in terms of tenure, and just sort of making that sort of point about differences in what we're looking at in dwellings is that sort of stats New Zealand census data figures, and we saw a uniform sort of increase in terms of the number of dwellings. However, we're mindful that in the last 10 years it's sort of very similar in terms of those percentage breakdowns. So layering on top of this, we've got a supply, we've got a demand. So here we start to look at how populations change. So we're sort of in those sort of statistics, Statistic New Zealand in terms of sort of movement. What's that? Talking about 3.5 million. Then we're sort of with a nation of 5 million, aren't we, in 2024?
We're more than 5 million now. It's creeping up to 5.5 million, isn't it?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. So I'm coining Jacinda's phrase when she was in charge, talking about we're a team of 5 million when COVID hit, wasn't it? That was the big phraseology. So you can see. Well, let's look at the shape of that, I suppose. And I think the points of steeper incline, 2014, sort of that 10-year point again. You can start to see the sort of the rise in terms of the steepness in population a little bit more there. I think it was. I think the big talking point is what happened in the last year, and with anyone who's following the news would pick up on that 130,000. Obviously, a lot of conversation about that tapering off. However, we need to be mindful of that. 130,000 people is a lot of people, isn't it? When we're talking about housing people, this was residents, it wasn't tourists. So that's going to have a structural change in the market that will correct.
They're not going to buy straight away, Graham, are they? I mean, the reality is the bulk of these people are going to rent first.
Yeah, and I think there's a strong inference that reception areas as well. It tends to be cities, notably I would imagine Auckland, are sort of areas where people start their journey if they're migrating. In migration, so I think that will sort of feed through into the housing system over the next 5 years as people sort of potentially move and buy their own properties, like you say, or make a different journey choice. So I think that's sort of interesting to keep in mind, that sort of population change, that steeper gradient, and the even steeper gradient we had over the last year. And okay, that's fallen away, but I think the point being that it's still part of the picture here. So just before we get into the sort of the ratios of dwellings and population, I think this is an element here is I did some calculations where we had the percentages. We looked at those percentages of the different tenures and then multiplied that through in terms of the number of dwellings to look at the actual numbers of owner-occupier population percentage, the private rented resident population dwellings as a percentage of dwelling percentage, and then the social housing component. I suppose in terms of private renter, in that red figure, we see that uniform rise over the last sort of 10 years. So we see an increase of 250,000 people in private renter in the last 10 years. But we need to be mindful that the owner occupier in absolute numbers is at 540,000. So even though we talk percentages and changes in percentages, you've got to remember that it's a significant number of units that are increasing in terms of owner occupation numbers. But private rents are 250,000 of the stock is private rented. And again, yes, we have to be mindful that people move between tenures. They might be owner occupier, they might rent out and fly off to Australia and work because there's not much employment opportunities. That's the macro picture that we can talk about towards the end, I guess. So that's just a sort of looking at that tenure differential in terms of absolute numbers, because we are looking at significant numbers. Now, this is where it gets interesting. I think, David, we've sort of been chatting about this over the last week or so, haven't we? And I think this is quite open for debate in terms of population of residents per dwelling. So this is total dwellings and annual population ratios over this 30-year period. And what we see is that if we look along the axes there, it's got whether it's 2.8, it would be like 2.8 people per dwelling, or if it's 2.55, it's 2.55 people. Yes, the statistics, I guess everyone is comfortable with this idea. We're looking at theoretically, we're not looking at 2.5 men. So we see that sort of general fall, don't we, in terms of number of people per dwelling. I think the ways in which we can start to unpick this is we always look at 2007, 2008, don't we? Because it's GFC, and that had a significant structural change in the economy. So you sort of saw that sort of fall down to sort of GFC period where less people per property, and then a sort of a gradual upward shift, more people per property per dwelling, and then COVID hits 2020. And we're seeing that significant fall away, despite this, I suppose the 2024 is that boost in population numbers that would have an impact. But this rises a lot. Yeah.
So Graham, what we're looking at here, the ratio of people per dwelling has dropped, which means that there's less people per house.
Yeah.
And so in 1991 it was what, 2.78.
Yeah.
We're looking at on this chart, and it's now down. So not a massive change, which then begs the question we had earlier: if there's actually a lower ratio of people per property, is there actually a housing crisis? And and the things that change. I know what you're saying before around interest rates, inflation, but I mean, do you think that I mean, this is speculation here, Graham, I know, but has the family dynamics led to changes in the number of dwellings? Are there more people divorcing? Are there more empty nesters? Are the kids going overseas, which means that there's less people in property? What do you think is the situation there?
I think there's a lot of sort of sociological aspects we can start to talk about here in terms of changes in terms of the family composition, extended families. We're never far from talking about houses of multiple occupation, HMO. So there might be houses where there's a lot of key workers and they just sort of flat together, those sorts of things. And the way that might be changing in terms of the structure of the employment market, how it relates to how people reside. It's not just families, for instance, that we need to think about here. If you think about within that family unit space, is a shift into, is this people having less kids? You could even sort of make those sorts of conversations. Aging population, quite clearly New Zealand is in that conversation about aging population. We touched on that a couple of reports ago. You could, more broadly, we're talking more homes, is there less people? But I think there's more to that. People leaving home, is it kids who would normally stay on in the family home may have gone off overseas? We start, that conversation's there, isn't it, in terms of, well, what's happening with the economy, employment, and people, that's the sort of the out migration sort of conversation that's part of it as well. And it's, so it's sort of a crisis of quality of life. I mean, you would argue that if households are becoming less crowded, quality of life possibly better. Isn't enough, but people would talk about crisis of housing as an affordability issue. So whether there's 2.8 or whether there's 2.6, people go, well, that's not the point. But I think there's something interesting here, isn't there, in terms of the falling number of people per household, per dwelling.
One of the things I was going to sorry, Graham, to just interrupt, but one of the things I was going to point out, I suspect there's a lot more apartments in places like Central Auckland, Wellington, and smaller properties like 1-2 bedroom units. So it will be interesting to see. I don't know how we could do this, Graham. I don't know if it's possible to do it. It's probably a question for you. Be interesting to see what if the ratio would change by, say, 3-bedroom properties or 4-bedroom properties. Because I suspect that there's probably a lot more 1-2 bedroom dwellings in New Zealand now as a percentage of dwellings as what there was when data was first collected.
Exactly. So, we're not in that sort of quarter acre type sort of mindset. There's a lot more, like you say. I think it's the typology of housing is part of this as well. A lot of new builds, sizes, and certainly a number of bedrooms that you mentioned. I think that you can sort of track that through looking at typology's getting a lot better in terms of you can look at apartments, and you can also, obviously, I think the apartments and I think the retirement sort of aspect to this as well is important, because in terms of talking about downsizing, a lot of that downsizing will mean that an aging population will be requiring smaller numbers of bedrooms. So that plays a part in sort of showing the supply side. So I think that's a good point, really, isn't it? In terms of this graph, we're talking about per dwelling, but what we can say is, well, per what type of dwelling? And what we're saying is that, what we're seeing in the wider market is that type of dwelling is probably potentially sort of shrinking in size. But there's still 4 beds being built, but as a proportion, you're going to see more apartments, aren't you? You see a lot more townhouses, down the market where we are in Christchurch. All the infill, a lot of infill development.
Even here in Palmerston North, Graham, where you look at the town and space isn't really an issue, but you're seeing a much more intense densification of properties being built. In a place where you'd see, just as an example, a section just not far from where I live has been developed, and there's just a row of modern terrace-style townhouses. I think if you're looking at Auckland, you'd look at, say, Hobsonville as a prime example as a region or as a district where it's a lot more intensified. And I suppose if a lot of immigrants are coming into the country from places like the Philippines, from India, they are used to apartment living. So, I mean, it's probably going to be quite sought after.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think with all the new changes, I suppose we need to talk policy as well. All the sort of whether the fast track or been in the pipeline for a long time and now in the fast track, a lot of the sort of the big developments, the few thousand type sort of developments. It'd be interesting to see the sort of number of bedrooms that are on offer, because from my vantage point, it's largely sort of three bed stuff. It's a viability, it's a developer viability sort of driving a lot of this as well. So it's sort of being mindful of the quality aspect in terms of what people are getting for bang for buck, and I suppose changes in terms of the building regs and all those sorts of things. There was conversations about granny flats and whether people have balconies and all those sorts of things. They do play a part in what's the typology of houses.
Well, it plays a big part, Graham, and we do a bit of work, and we have a lady who does speaking at some of our investment nights that we do, a lady called Ilse Wolf, who does a bit of property coaching around renovations. And one of the things that she looks at now, particularly as tax policies become more favourable to investors, and you can offset interest payments, you can look for the second-hand dwellings that you can add value to, increase your yield, increase your rent, increase the value. It's very hard to add value to a brand new townhouse because you're limited to how you can extend out. So, I mean, look, fascinating information as ever.
Yeah, just a sort of one final point, sort of the Airbnbization of where the market's changed in the last 5 years as well. Everyone's always thinking, right, what part of this property can I use from some extra passive income? So that's going to play a big part in that typology and number of dwellings and number of people. If people are playing a more mindful way in which they're going to try and get that extra passive income, it's going to really skew the numbers. And what you see in the census and what people put in terms of lodging in terms of extra tenants and all those sorts of things. So yeah, I suppose where I'm going that is technology is changing everything, and we're never far away from talking technology, AI, and all the rest of it. But I think the reality of how it plays through into the market is going to be a lot more volatile and a lot more sort of people calling the shots on how they do things a little bit more. So I guess the industry has to be more agile to what's happening. If people are choosing to rent out the property for 6 months of the year and then they head overseas, to match what their employment lifestyle is. People a bit more gig economy in terms of they might be working for 6 months of the year and then they'll rent out and move overseas and do stuff. We're a lot more connected in terms of space and the way we work, I guess. So that's probably a bit more deeper thinking stuff, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I mean, the alarm's just gone off at our head office here, so there's someone's shut up the bill. Oh no, they've just turned it off again. Anyway, that's all right. I was just thinking who's got it there. Well, that's probably a cue to end tonight's discussion, Graham.
Sounds good.
Thanks a lot again for all your time and your work. If people want to get hold of you, I mean, here's a quick chance to plug what you do. I mean, how do people get hold of Professor Graham Squires?
Yeah, just Google the property knowledge, and you'll get the work that we do with this consultancy. And then if there's any sort of uni-based work, just Graham Squires, Lincoln University. So always interested in anything sort of conceptual and practical, and working in partnership with companies. So please get in touch. The property knowledge.
All right, excellent. Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone, for tuning in. And if you have any questions, you've got Graham's details. This has also been recorded, so people are able to watch it again. We'll be able to put a link onto Graham's contact details. And thanks for tuning in. If you want to get the report, you can easily just find it on the Property Brokers website, or you can go to the Property Knowledge website, able to download the report. And thanks a lot, Graham. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.